of the Palestinian refugee by UNRWA, we know that, you know much better than I do, that Palestinian refugees were not initially considered as the other refugees by the UN Convention, by the UNHCR, the 1951. So Palestinian refugees came to be defined by the UNRWA definition of what refugee is, and the UNRWA definition was very much shaped by, you know, what were the needs, you know, the immediate needs of relief of people, the masses of people who needed help right away, you know, and so that definition was very simple and excluded lots of people. And the definition, as you know, was that a Palestinian refugee is a person whose normal residence was Palestine for a minimum of 2 years preceding the outbreak of the conflict in 1948, and who, as a result of this conflict, has lost both his home and his means of livelihood. And this is the definition. Of course, this definition excludes so many people who were still in need but were displaced, or those, of course, who were displaced but who were just maybe 2 kilometers away from home. And so it's a very, very precarious definition. But what I want to talk about, what is very interesting of the Palestinian case, there is a for example, there is a very interesting study that was carried out in Gaza, where the refugees are actually a much higher number than the actual the natives. Okay, so this is one of the peculiarities of the Palestine issue, that refugees very often are more than the actual inhabitants, the natives, and also. Of course, you know, the refugees, for example, in Gaza, as in the West Bank, have been at home in a way. I mean, they have been among Palestinians, speaking the same language, speaking the same, having the same religion very often, and so on and so forth. So this is very interesting, because in most experiences in the world, the person who flees from his country or her country finds him or herself in a situation where he's an alien, you know, amidst people who have a different religion, different culture, different language. This didn't occur in this context. So the ways in which refugees were differentiated from citizens or natives was much more interesting, and this is what I think would be interesting to talk about. So, for example, we know that how did the notion of refugee come to be constructed in the Palestinian context is that first of all we have to consider, and we will see how this was done. The notion of refugees that was taking place in 1948, 1950 in Palestine was happening at the same time where hundreds of thousands of refugees in Europe also were fleeing from the post-World War situation. So this regime that started to define who is a refugee and who is not was not only taking place in Palestine, but was also taking place elsewhere in Europe, for example. So this definition, the UNRWA definition, was a definition that was very, as we said, very, very simple and very simplistic, but it also had connections with what was happening elsewhere in the world. So we are in the context of post-World War II situation in Europe and elsewhere. So of course, while in Europe, a refugee was a person who was constructed as in opposition to the citizen. So those who were already residing in a nation state, in a sovereign nation state, had to receive, there had just been Nazism, the Nazi fascist regimes, and so, we have to think about the millions of Jews also who were fleeing, but also, refugees from different parts of the world. And the idea was that these people needed to be at least somehow rescued or helped. So the construction of the notion of refugees was a construction that the humanitarian organizations invented this notion to differentiate between those who were citizens with full rights and those who were in need of help. And it was also a way for the states to deal with their responsibilities, okay? Because they had created in the first place the refugees, so they had to deal with the consequences, okay? So the category of refugee itself is a very problematic category. It's a category that it's very artificial. It has to do with how you differentiate between different people, those who have access to full rights and those who because the states acted in certain ways, happen not to have the same type of rights, but it's a very artificial definition, okay? So it's very interesting because in the context of Palestine, I think the category of refugee had to be, constructed also against those who had full rights, full citizenship rights, who are the citizens. But who were the citizens in Palestine in 1948? There were no sovereign states. I mean, the West Bank was shortly to become a Jordanian colonized entity. Gaza was under Egyptian administration. So what was a citizen in a context where there was no sovereign state? And what kind of categories were put in place to differentiate between a refugee and a citizen? And I think these are very interesting questions because I think by thinking through those questions, we start to also realize that some of these categories are very artificial and they have been invented by the humanitarian regime that started to deal with the actual material issues that people who were displaced had to resolve. But then afterwards, these categories stayed with us for so many years, and now we identify with them. But maybe we have to go to the roots and see how they were in the first place put in place and what it meant to be, what they meant at the very beginning. So it's interesting, for example, in my work, for example, I try, especially in Lebanon, for example, I try to look at refugees, Palestinian refugees, not only as those who flew from their country because of persecution, because they were not allowed to come back and so on, but also those through which we can understand who is a Lebanese citizen in the first place. It's only if you look at refugees sometimes that you can understand the whole meaning of what it means to be a citizen. What is this strange idea? Who is a Lebanese citizen? The Lebanese citizen only exists vis-a-vis as against the Palestinian refugee, because the Lebanese citizen, him or herself, is a very flawed category. You don't have equality there. You have a society that is cross-cut by sectarianism, class, gender. Especially sectarianism is very important. You have a society that has been divided for so many years, and the only way in which it comes together is by opposing itself to the Palestinian refugee. But also, if you sort of start doing research on Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, you realize that what they talk about is precisely this: is they help you to understand what is that, how all these categories are very, very, very problematic. And in my work, I see really, I think, of course, return is very important, and the right of return is a sacred right, and the first thing that anyone tells you about is, I want to return. But when you go beyond, a little bit beyond the political claim, which is, absolutely crucial, what you start to actually hearing from people is that they are a very crucial standpoint to understand the fallacies, the problems of these Arab states. You can understand the problems, the discrimination that native and non-native experience by listening to the narratives of the refugees. So the refugees, for me, are not only those who have been excluded from or who are unable to return, but they are those from which a new political culture can emerge, a new political culture through which to understand the very flawed, the very problematic ways in which differences and resources are distributed, and the very problematic ways in which the notion of being a native entitles you with more rights than being a non-native. Who said that being a non-native should be a situation from which you should enjoy less rights? Why is that? We should be able to problematize these notions. Who invented this idea that it is by being a member of a nation state only that you can be entitled to have dignity, rights, resources? I think this is a very problematic idea, and it has to do with the ways in which, especially after the Second World War, these categories of being a native and therefore a citizen and being a refugee had been inserted into the ideas, into societies, and we came to believe in them, and we came to identify with them. But we have to really be, much more critical. So it's very interesting because, as you know much better than I do, when you talk about people, to people about refugees, there is this idea that Palestinian refugees who, came and they are a bit alien in the society. I mean, there is still this idea that if you are a refugee and maybe you live in a camp, you are somehow, not a native, okay? And therefore you are not, the original, you are not the authentic somehow. But also there are all kinds of stigmas, you are maybe a bit poorer, a bit more underdeveloped, and so on. There are all kinds of stigmas attached to being a refugee. In Palestine, in Gaza. Okay, so to wrap up today's, or to kind of come back a little bit to the theoretical issues, no? We have, are you familiar with, of course, the work of Giorgio Agamben? You have heard about him a lot, no? Okay, so I think that Giorgio Agamben and Hannah Arendt, we won't have the time to go into their work, but I think they provided some of the most interesting, challenging ideas on how to rethink the refugee and refugeehood in ways that are very unconventional, if you want. So, his work, Homo Sacer, was published in 1995. He argues in this work that the refugee is the most potent, most interesting and dramatic embodiment of the constitutive problems of the nation's sovereign state. In his work, he shows how the refugee is basically, after the First War, the refugee started to symbolize these dramatic contradictions of the sovereign nation state. Because on the one hand, nation states started to differentiate between an authentic life, a bare life, which has no political value, through, for example, racism, eugenetics, and all those biopolitical modes of control and of categorizing people. So, on the one hand, paradoxically, you have the droit de l'homme, the right of man, which is the basis upon which citizenship rights are inscribed. The idea is that you have, you have rights as citizens because you are, you are a bare life. You are, on the basis of the right of man. But then ultimately, after the war, the right of man started to be separated from citizenship rights, from the realm of sovereignty, and the right of man started to be used outside the context of sovereignty, with the aim of protecting what Agamben calls a bare life, which ultimately comes to be expelled or marginalized or located at the margins of the nation state. So initially, what was initially thought of as, what Agamben wants to really argue is that the refugee is a category that comes to be, that is constitutively problematic because it's the quintessential representation of how, of the misinterpretation or the depoliticization of the right of man. On the one hand, you have citizenship right because you are a bare life, because you have to be protected as a bare life, as an entity that has no political value in and of itself. But at the same time, after the war, this bare life, the refugee becomes, in fact, an entity that is expelled from those rights and start to be managed by humanitarianism and humanitarian law. And this humanitarian law becomes as an exception to the rule, an exception to the sovereign state. So, in a way, it becomes a terrain upon which the sovereign state builds itself. And it becomes a way to differentiate between who's a citizen and who's not. Okay? It becomes a tool through which people are built into a hierarchy. Okay? And it's a paradoxical yet constitutive element of the sovereign nation state. And this is very important, if you bear with me on this point, because this is where we should start from in order to deconstruct the idea that a state is a solution. A state is not a solution. A state is where the problem starts. Because states in Europe, which we think of as the realm of civilization and democracy and liberal rights, is where is where all these problems were created in the first place. All these constitutive contradictions were, there at the very beginning, and we are still bearing the consequences of them. And the whole realm of humanitarianism, through which the refugee, this bare life, was first created and then maintained in that state of exception, in that state of at the margin. That's the problem that we are dealing with even today. Now, of course, you know, for us as Palestinians, there is one more layer that we need to think about, because of course, you know, we have a right of return, and this right of return, you know, the extent to which this right of return is linked or not to the status we have as refugees, we need to think about it, you know, because maybe the question is that we can think about ways in which we stop being refugees in these negative senses, in the sense of being, you know, managed by humanitarianism, by depoliticized laws, by laws that confine us, or you know, those of us who are refugees, who confine us in a zone of in the non-political zone, in a zone of, as Agamben says, you know, of indistinction, of humanitarianism. And yet we still can fight for our right of return. Why not? Why can't you return on the basis of being also a full citizen? Or maybe a full citizen is not what we want, but we want rights, wherever this can come from, wherever, you know. And this is the problem I want to grapple with, because I think that in a way, being a refugee is according to humanitarian law and to international law, is embodying those very contradictions that start to be very clear after the First and especially the Second World War, and you find yourself in a paradoxical situation because you confine yourself to a non-political zone, to a zone where sovereignty doesn't exist, by being a refugee and being managed by humanitarianism. But at the same time, this is the basis upon which we are told that we can claim our right of return. Why not thinking about ways of differentiating the two, and ultimately thinking that we still can claim rights wherever we are on the basis of being, you know, full-fledged human beings who have rights to dignified lives wherever you are, with all that comes with it, and still claim a right of return? Who said that the right of return can only come from a basis of, you know, refugeehood in that sense of the term? I don't know whether it's clear to you what I mean. No.
Can you explain it more?
Yeah?
Can you explain it more?
Yes, I mean, what I'm saying is that I think the work of Giorgio Agamben was very crucial in showing how the refugee as a category became, I mean, was kind of the consequence of the ways in which the sovereign, the rule of law, has always operated through making some exceptions. Okay? So the rule of law and the sovereign state exists. One of the constitutive elements of the sovereign state is that it can make exceptions to who is not a citizen. You know, the sovereign can decide who is a citizen and who's not, who deserves to be included and who deserves to be excluded. And since the Second World War, the problem of the nation state in Europe has been actually who to consider included, who to consider a citizen, and who doesn't belong to that category. So, as a matter of fact, Palestinians were not the only ones, for example, that were excluded from UNHCR 1951. I mean, for example, there were many refugees in mainly it was the European refugees who got that status, but many refugees who were non-European were, you know, also put into the category on a layer, you know, on a lower base. But the issue is, what happens is that if one of the problems of the sovereign nation state is deciding, you know, or one of the contradictions is deciding who belongs and who doesn't belong, the refugee as a category is a constitutive element. You need the refugee. You need someone who's excluded. But with the second, you know, after the Second World War, this exclusion also was institutionalized by the fact that all these masses of people were managed and assisted by humanitarian law and humanitarian agencies, which further depoliticized and further exceptionalized their existence as non-sovereign, as non-citizens. Okay? And this is something that is very problematic, very contradictory, because basically by being a refugee in that particular context, you are basically denied political agency. You are You are a life that doesn't have political value. You are a life that is only governed and managed by humanitarianism, which is by definition a space, a non-political space, okay? So how to solve this contradiction is one of the issues that I think we need to talk about and we need to think about.